It works? Can anybody hear me out there? Gosh, you can hear my thoughts with this. Wow, powerful. Well, thank you all for coming here tonight. I want to spend the next hour or so kind of sharing various elements of my own personal story about my near-death experience 16 years ago. But then also really go into kind of the broader class of similarities with other experiences that people have had and kind of the scientific study of all of that. And then also a lot of mention of kind of personal journeying, that is through meditation, centering prayer, specific recommendations about meditation and about the different ways we can come to know this grander sense of self. For me, as an academic neurosurgeon, I went through an incredibly powerful wake-up call back in November of 2008, a little over 16 years ago. And I'm still just beginning to unravel all the implications of what I went through. Before all that, I was very much a conventionally trained neuroscientist, neurosurgeon. I'd spent 15 years teaching neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School. Thought I had some understanding of brain, mind, consciousness, and the nature of reality. But what I learned during a week-long deep coma, from which I should not have returned according to medical science, and yet I was able to return and have a complete recovery. And therein is part of the message, the power that we have within mind to influence and modulate our emerging reality. And that is never more obvious than in the case of surviving certain illnesses, but also especially in just kind of coming into oneness and wholeness and healing as a higher soul. Because ultimately, the message I'll be conveying tonight is kind of the scientific case for the reality of your eternal soul. And the only important thing in this universe are really the connections between souls. So it's so important to acknowledge this binding force of love and all the power it has. Now, I grew up in a medical family. My adoptive father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. And in many ways, he taught me much more than I could even know back in those days. And he's the one who led me into this field of neurosurgery. And yet, he was also one who had a very strong belief in God. He spent 2 years in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War as a combat surgeon, first in New Guinea, then in the Philippines, and finally Japan over those 2 years. I still have at my bedside table that pocket Bible that he carried with him those 2 years. It's New Testament and Psalms. And I think that's what got him through World War II relatively unscathed. He came back to the U.S. and ended up running a neurosurgical training program. He was always very scientific, fully advised on modern Big Bang cosmology and physics, neuroscience, of course, and yet for him there was never any conflict with his very robust belief in the real existence of God and the power of prayer. He used them all the time in his neurosurgical practice in healing people. Now, I grew up in the 60s. Like many of us from that era, I always knew that science is the pathway to truth. But like so many other people, I made the mistake of seeing the science as reductive materialist Newtonian determinism, because that's really kind of the science of the 21st century. In spite of the fact that quantum physics was trying to emerge, and of course has emerged as one of the most powerful tools we've ever gained in the scientific endeavor, quantum physics is still not well understood by so many. And some of the deepest lesson of quantum physics has to do with the primacy of mind. And so that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit tonight, and about kind of the conversion I went through from this extraordinary experience that really defied the principles of modern neuroscience. I mean, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't have been able to have any experience. And yet I had this profound, robust, detailed, meaningful, and transformational spiritual experience that not only allowed me to survive this weak and deep coma due to a gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis, but to end up having a full recovery. And all that is fully supported not just in my book, Proof of Heaven, and in the follow-up books, Map of Heaven, and the one that's on sale here right tonight, after we finish this talk, is Living in a Mindful Universe. That's the third book. And that's the one that really brings it all together. I'll be talking a lot about the material that's in that book as we go through this evening. Now, important to point out that I was adopted. This is right at the core of my story, and those who've read the book Proof of Heaven will kind of recognize the importance of that and some of the deep messages dependent on my adoption story. And my adoption was such that my 16-year-old unwed mother had me, and then with failure to thrive, I was hospitalized at age 11 days. But they took me away from her, social services did. But she wasn't really ready to let me go, and she thought she'd be able to get me back. But no, that wasn't going to happen back in 1954, that social services would give a child who had failure to thrive with an unwed teenage mother back to the mother. And so finally, after 4 months, she signed the papers to let me go. And so I spent 4 months in a baby dorm, kind of in a form of purgatory. And I know that my adoptive father, the neurosurgeon, used to tell me, there's no way you can remember anything that happened to you in those first few days and weeks and month or 2 or 3 of your life. And I believed him, but I know now in retrospect he was wrong. It was one of the biggest influences on my life was this smoking crater that my own mother had left me behind. And what I mean by that is there was this kind of deep subconscious thinking that if my own mother left me behind, maybe I didn't deserve the love and to be in this universe. So as much as I seemed to thrive on the surface, and certainly my kind of cognitive experience was one of a happy childhood and all that, but there was always this memory that I'd been left behind, and maybe I wasn't worthy of the love of this world. And that's what my NDE, my deep coma experience, resolved forcefully, in a beautiful and affirmative direction. But it's important to point out that I was struggling with that through much of my life. Now, I'd like to share with you some of the elements of my NDE that are important to acknowledge, just to kind of make the scientific points and the spiritual points that I'll be making about the soul. One thing to say about my NDE is it's very unusual in one respect, at least one respect, and that is that I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander when I went through it. I had no memories of my life. I had no knowledge of Earth. I had no language, no knowledge of humans, this universe. It was an empty slate. Now, when I first came back to this world in the weeks and months after my coma, I was defaulting to some of my old thinking. Well, memories, we think memories are stored in the brain. This meningitis had ravaged my neocortex. There was really no place left. So maybe that explains that incredible amnesia I had. But I was already benefiting in those early weeks from a return of those memories. And in fact, by 2 months post-coma, all of my memories had returned. And in fact, through deep discussions with family and friends about early childhood events, I came to realize that much of what happened in the return of those memories was really, the memories were of a higher quality and more detailed than they had been before my coma. So clearly there was great evidence there that memories are not even stored in the brain. That's something we went into in detail in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. There's a whole appendix on the fact that memories are not stored in the brain. And once you realize the bigger context of all this, that makes perfect sense, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But what happened with my coma is it all started at 4:30 in the morning, November 10th, 2008. Severe back pain. I woke up in a sweat, tried to take a hot bath, hoping that would relieve the discomfort. Almost couldn't get out of the tub. Then baby steps back to my bed where I collapsed, writhing in agony, with severe back pain. And soon thereafter, my youngest son, Bond, interesting name given his role in how this whole story evolves, Bond came in the room, age 10, and saw Dad wasn't off at work, and not only that, but wow, he seems to be in horrific pain. He started rubbing my temples to make me feel better. And as soon as he touched my head, I felt like he'd driven a white-hot spike right through my head, just horrible pain. And that was the beginning of meningitis, a severe case of bacterial meningitis. And I didn't realize it, but this E. coli, and we never found out how I got it, but it was started to really accelerate. It turns out if you do the mathematics for something like E. coli, it reproduces about every 20 minutes. So if you start out with one bacterium, 12 hours later you can have several trillion. I mean, these things really take off. And not only that, but the lab values, for example, show that my cerebrospinal fluid glucose level, and you or me, that would be 80 to 90. In somebody with severe bacterial meningitis, their glucose in their CSF would be maybe 20. Well, mine was 1. So the bacteria had run out of glucose, and they were ravaging my brain. All lobes of my brain were affected. That was clear from the CT and MRI scans they did. And I was in a very deep coma. What my family saw, of course, was I was lying there on a ventilator on 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics doing nothing. And what the doctors recognized was that my Glasgow coma scale was alarmingly low. In you or me, that Glasgow coma scale would be 15. A corpse gets a 3. Anything below 9 is deep coma. And most of that week, I was probably 6 or 7, if not down as low as 5. There was one point in the emergency room where I cried out, "God help me." And just by using language, that boosted me up to a score of 11, just that one little moment. I have no memory of saying that at all. It happened after about 2 hours of kind of agitated seizures and moaning and groaning. And then I was gone from this world for the next 7 days. So my family had to suffer through all of that. The doctors thought they estimated I started that week with a 10% chance of survival. By the end of the week, down to 2% chance. But at that point, no chance of recovery. And that's when they recommended during a family meeting on Sunday morning, day 7 of coma, that they stop the antibiotics and take me off the ventilator and let me go. And that's when I actually started coming back to this world. When I did, my brain was still horribly savaged by the experience. And in fact, after I woke up and they extubated me, I still spent 36 hours in and out of a paranoid, delusional, psychotic nightmare because my brain was so damaged by the meningitis. But deep in the coma, during that week in coma, was an extraordinary journey that was very highly detailed and memorable and transformational that happened at a time when medical documentation, including a medical case report that was written by 3 doctors who were fascinated by my recovery. And that came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018. But they made it very clear my brain was far too damaged to have any kind of dream or hallucination. And that's why my case is so valuable to the scientific community, because they recognize that I shouldn't have been able to have any experience, much less this extraordinary multidimensional kind of higher level of reality experience that I had, so common in the NDE literature, and then was able to come back to this world. Now, I want to take you through some of the elements of that journey as I went through it. In this very amnesic setting, it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, kind of unresponsive realm. It was like being in dirty jello. I do have memories of feeling roots or blood vessels around me. It was kind of this very kind of foreboding subterranean existence. And yet, because of the amnesia, it's the only thing I'd ever known. So that was fine. This is existence. You know, it was never as foreboding as the language would suggest. But the good news is I wasn't there forever, because there came a slowly spinning white light with fine silvery and golden tendrils around it, and it came towards me with a perfect musical melody. And that was very important because in this earthworm's eye view, I've been there for quite a while, and the only sound I knew was this pounding, like someone smashing an anvil. And yet now, here comes this beautiful light with this lovely melody, and it opens up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view realm and led me up into this brilliant, ultra-real Gateway Valley, place that I called the Gateway Valley in my writings in the first few weeks out of coma. And in that beautiful setting, this incredible, it's like a world of ideals. Plato's world of ideals, where there's no imperfection at all. And this would be the realm where we would go through things like reuniting with souls of departed loved ones, meeting up with our soul group, going through life reviews, you know, your life flashing before your eyes. Very important concept that I'll cover in more detail shortly. But that would all happen in this kind of realm between the spiritual and the earthly, the Gateway Valley. And as I said, it's a world of kind of perfection. And the way I witnessed this was this beautiful meadow that was filled with thousands of beings who were out there dancing, lots of joy and merriment, children playing, dogs jumping, incredible festivities. And all of that was being fueled up above by these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants, anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. It's incredible majesty and awe to it all, but a beautiful sense of being home. This is what I think resonated with so many people who read the book Proof of Heaven, because thousands of people wrote to me afterwards and said there was something about my language, the way I described the experience. And it doesn't mean that your journey has to involve butterflies or this or that. The details are not quite as important as the big storyline itself and the transformational power of it. And so many people were influenced just by that, and it reminded them, yes, this is something I have known too. Even though these memories are very deeply buried. We don't remember past lives so readily. I mean, those of us who do the hypnotic regression, address them through meditation, etc., yes, we're more familiar with that. But past lives and reincarnation was not something I was at all familiar with. And yet in my journey, it was shown very clearly to me that it takes more than one incarnation to get this kind of spiritual work done as an evolving soul. And that's why we come back multiple times in this process of growth and transformation and evolution. And I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But in this beautiful setting, in this Gateway Valley, the best part about it was I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman beside me. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations. And witnessing all this beauty with me was this young woman. And she had sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, high forehead, broad smile. And she looked at me with a look of pure love. And she never said a word. She didn't have to, because her emotional knowing and truth came into my awareness. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. You can do no wrong. I wish I'd said that last part a little more carefully in the book Proof of Heaven, because I don't think I'd sufficiently introduced people to the glory of the beauty of the binding force of love of this realm. So that when I heard from her, you can do no wrong, I already knew that in the setting where our life reviews occur, love, kindness, compassion, mercy, these are the ambience of that existence. So anything that's less than that, selfish, greedy, giving out pain and suffering to others, looks especially bad in that life review. So when I was told you can do no wrong, what that really was telling me is I know how to discern the pathway forward here. And I can choose. I can choose to offer love and kindness and acceptance to all my fellow beings, or I could choose otherwise. If I choose otherwise to, hand out pain and suffering, then I'm only choosing a much more arduous pathway for myself, because in the life review, you end up facing those things. And there's this incredible sense that the life review is really teaching us the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. And for me, that was an incredibly beautiful lesson at that point, but I'll never forget this beautiful guardian angel I found in my later readings of the Indian literature. That's how I should label this beautiful young woman. And it turns out she appeared to me every time I passed through there, because I would ascend to higher and higher levels, but then spontaneously tumble back down to that earthworm eye view. But by remembering the musical notes of the melody, that's how I could conjure up those light portals that would lead me up into higher and higher spiritual realms. So in the Gateway Valley, I remember in my first passage through there on this beautiful butterfly wing and witnessing all this incredible festivity going on below. The entire scene was lit by clouds of pure color. And I cannot emphasize enough the power of that musical setting, of those beautiful chants and anthems and hymns, these swooping angels delivering this incredible glory, all in the sense of this is your spiritual home. You are deeply loved and cherished by the universe at large. There was a point early on in that first passage through the Gateway Valley where I had what I call the divine wind, or the breath of God. And what happened was I felt it as a soft summer breeze that blew through. And even though my description of the various elements of the scene would remain the same after that breeze, it turns out that my emotional engagement shifted dramatically into this knowing of the love and the binding force of love and the power of that to bring us into wholeness and healing as souls. And that was an extraordinary vision that all came with that kind of breath of God. And that was the precursor to kind of my next phase of the journey. And what happened then was I recognized that all of the lowest, the material realm, four-dimensional space-time, which I could vaguely sense from the spiritual level, all of that collapsed down. And then all of the spiritual level, the Gateway Valley, all of that ended up collapsing down too into this complex oversphere. And then I ascended up through another light portal that was provided by the angelic choirs. There was always an association of beautiful music with these portals between spiritual dimensions. And in fact, they came in very handy. The memory of those musical notes were what actually enabled me to conjure up that light portal from the lowest levels when I would spontaneously tumble back down to that earthworm eye view again, which happened several times during this journey. Now, in the final level, though, I ascended up to what I call the core. And a core I often describe it as a dazzling darkness. It was a complete resolution of all the dualities of this world. We live in a world where we have dark, light, good, evil, masculine, feminine, all these various spectra of possibilities of existence. In the core realm, all of it was collapsed into this pure oneness. And the beautiful aspect of that is that in that pure oneness, at the source of all that emerges in this universe, there was nothing but love. So any of the apparent darkness and evil and whatever trace amounts out here in this universe, they're there to serve as kind of a catalyst to help nudge us towards that oneness with the divine by making the choices of love and kindness and compassion in how we live our lives and how we deal with our fellow beings. In that core realm, I was told, we'll teach you many things, but you'll be going back. And there were many lessons there that had to do with our humanity as well as our spiritual nature, this oneness of mind, an incredibly rich environment for that. And yet, in the midst of these lessons, I would tumble back down to that earthworm eye view. And by remembering the musical notes of the melody, that's how I could conjure up the pathway back into the Gateway Valley, always reassured by that beautiful guardian angel, the beautiful young woman on the butterfly wing, and then on to the next level, back to the core for more lessons. In fact, some of the richest lessons there involved seeing this bigger picture of life reviews and reincarnation. Because of the amnesia, I could not have an Eben Alexander life review because it was important. The amnesia, I came to realize in many months after the coma, was very important because if I had scripted this, my adoptive father would have been my spiritual guide. He had passed over 4 years before my coma. So if you'd asked me, who do you want to see on this journey? It absolutely would have been my adoptive father, and yet he was nowhere to be found. Now, the further continuation of that story is found in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe, our third book, where I talk about how 2.5 years after my coma, during a deep meditation, using sacred acoustics, binaural beat brainwave entrainment, I was able to encounter my father. And he made it very clear to me in that appearance why he could not be, quote, apparent to me during my NDE. And the message was, if I'd seen him, in spite of the fact that I had a 1 in 10 million diagnosis of E. coli meningoencephalitis in an adult, and also a 1 in a billion recovery, if my father had been the one there, I would have been a little more tempted, given my pre-coma materialist scientific assumptions, to say, oh, you just see who you want to see on the way out. That's why it had to be somebody different, somebody at a much deeper level. And those who've read the book Proof of Heaven will recall that at the end of that book, as everything comes together, my adoption story and this beautiful guardian angel, all of a sudden it starts to make sense as I discover her identity. And it has a lot to do with my adoption story. And I won't go into much more detail about that. We may have time in the Q&A to cover that more if you're interested. I know many of you know that story. But the fact is that in this extraordinary set of journeying, I knew that my birth father, my adoptive father, if I had seen him, I would have been more tempted to just believe, oh my gosh, It seemed way too real to be real, but this explains it more. But it didn't have that kind of spiritual explanation, and I had to go much deeper. And that's why when I saw my father in meditation 2.5 years after my coma, and he made it very clear to me that I was on the right pathway in terms of investigating consciousness, the power of things like sacred acoustics, binaural beat brainwave entrainment to engender deep states of conscious awareness and exploration, that I was on the right pathway. And that was the message I got from him. But the beautiful guardian angel, that lovely young woman, that was the message I got 4 months after my coma when I got a picture in the mail from my birth sister, of the birth sister who had died 2 years before I knew of her existence. That was back in 1998. In fact, my birth sister lived here in Los Angeles. She was down in Huntington Beach. In fact, the picture that was sent to me in the mail was a picture of her taken by the Balboa Island ferry 3 weeks before she passed from this world back in June of 1998. And she has this beautiful smile, and she looks like she's full of life. And to know that her bodily existence was going to come to an end 3 weeks later, would be a very sad thought if I hadn't realized that I first discovered her by witnessing her presence in the afterlife in a very real form, alive and well and thriving. And in fact, in that picture, it's like she's looking at me like, do you finally get it? And yes, Betsy, I finally get it. And often when I give talks about Betsy, about that beautiful guardian angel, I would get misty-eyed and teary every time I tell the story. And people in the audience sometimes would take pictures. And the interesting thing is in many of those pictures, you could see this brilliant purple or white orb of light right beside me when I was talking about Betsy. And there's Betsy's picture up on the screen, during these talks. And this beautiful orb. And so I came to recognize, not only do I get misty-eyed because of its a fond memory of a sister that I never knew in this earthly plane, but also that she's right here. She's here with me. And she's helping to share this story. That's a beautiful part of it. Now, it turns out towards the end of this journey, as I cycled through these multiple levels, as I said, I was told every time I entered the core, you're not here to stay, we'll teach you many things. Well, there came a point where I spontaneously tumbled back down to that earthworm eye view. I tried to conjure up the musical notes and the melody to usher up that light portal into the Gateway Valley, and it no longer worked. Now, I can tell you that was something that brought some sadness to me in the moment, but I also knew at that point I could trust that I would be taken care of, that this beautiful God force that I encountered, especially in the core realm, where I recognized in the core, in that beautiful dissolution of everything into this pure oneness in the state of binding force of love, that my very conscious awareness was directly sourced in that God force. So just like more than 90% of near-death experiencers, going back through all of history, across all continents, whatever belief systems they had before, many were atheist or agnostic before their experience, but more than 90% of them come away not only believing in, but knowing from personal experience in the reality of an infinitely loving God force at the core of creation. And it's not like you have to label this as, do we want to call it God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, all the many names we attach to it. Religious ideologies try and do that, try and claim it as their own, almost like you're joining a football team or a political party. But it turns out that ultimately, the deep reality of NDEs is that as long as we have come to know and believe and trust in a God of love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness, that puts us on that pathway. So it's not the ideology and the claim of the prophet that you might want to believe in, so much as the role of love, the binding force of love, and kindness and compassion, and really taking care of each other without exclusion. So to the extent that any religion acknowledges the power and the importance of love and kindness and compassion in everything they do, great, they're on the right pathway. But as soon as a religion starts to kind of adopt an exclusive standpoint, it's our way, not their way, etc., tries to put others down and takes the focus away from love, compassion, and kindness, that religious system has kind of lost its way. But the good news is that science supports a lot of what's being discovered now in the NDE world. Science has certain mechanisms that allow us to come into a sharing of objective truth and come into a common belief. And religions have had many thousands of years to teach us that golden rule. NDEs and the science of NDEs really bring that kind of concept of oneness and love right to the fore, where all of us can take advantage of that. And this is where meditation and centering prayer are so important in living our lives, because the more you start to realize how important the mental realm is, that the realm in which we connect with our fellow souls and spirits in the spiritual energy field, that is really where the power is. And you don't have to have an NDE to come into this kind of knowledge. But hearing of these stories, of near-death experience stories, I think is very important, because they help to wake people up to the big potential that's out there. And especially when we have scientific study of NDEs. And for example, Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, wrote a paper in the esteemed medical journal Lancet back in 2001 of almost 400 cardiac arrest patients in the Netherlands over many years. And about 1 in 5 of those patients had a profound near-death experience. So they're not uncommon. Now, 1 in 5, I don't know why the other 4 in 5 weren't reporting these. I think it has to do with memory. Sometimes we don't remember these things. The memories can come back through hypnotic regression, through meditation, through hypnosis, EMDR, things like that are ways to resurrect these memories. But this is where I think the science is very important, because it is the science not just of NDEs, but there's a whole host of other kind of related phenomena that go beyond that to help to flesh out the picture we're talking about here. For example, there's something called shared death experiences. And shared death are where a loved one, usually, it can be a healthcare worker, but usually a loved one. And the loved one can be either at the bedside or they could be 1,000 miles away, it doesn't matter. But what happens is the patient who is dying, as their soul is preparing to leave the body, it will come along and get the soul of that bystander soul, of the shared death experiencer, and take it along, even to the point of witnessing a full-blown life review. And it turns out, I know that Raymond Moody, who wrote the original book on near-death experiences back in 1975, Life After Life, he wrote another book called Glimpses of Eternity. I think 2011 was when it was published. And that book is all about shared death experiences. He'd been accumulating them along with the near-death experiences, but they're not as common. Maybe one-tenth as common as the near-death experiences are. But shared death happened in perfectly healthy people. And shared death, I remember I used to have people come up to me after I would give a talk about my experience, and they would basically say, I want to tell you something I've never told anybody else before. And then they'd share a story that could change this world. And most of those were near-death experiences or after-death communications. But about 1 in 10 was of a shared death experience. I didn't even know what to call them back in those early days. And it turns out that since then, William Peters, who lives up in Santa Barbara, has started something called the Shared Crossing Project. And he wrote a book called At Heaven's Door. That book was about 5 or 6 years ago, I think it came out. But his work is all about shared death experiences. He had his own shared death experience back in the 1970s, working in the AIDS crisis up in San Francisco. And he was reading with a patient, an AIDS patient who was almost hours from death. And all of a sudden, William realized that he and the spirit of this patient were up on the ceiling looking down at him reading to the patient. And they look at each other like, get this. So, yeah, this kind of thing happens. But a healthcare worker can easily be involved in a shared death experience like that. So if you Google Shared Crossing Project, or look more into William Peters and his work, you'll find out a lot more of that. Excuse me, that kind of thing. And he has even coming up with systems to help people who want to have a shared crossing experience with their loved one. And right now he's claiming that roughly 50% of his participants end up having some major elements of a shared crossing in this kind of program. So very, very exciting work. Now, the other thing to mention about NDEs in general is this kind of quality of knowing, the quality of the information that you obtain in an NDE. I said it was way too real to be real. Those were the words that I used with my son, Eben the Fourth, my older son, who had been there during my coma, helping hold my hand and keep me tethered to this world like other family members. But then he had to go back to school after I started coming around. But he ended up coming back home 2 days after I got out of the hospital. And I remember telling him, he drove overnight because he'd heard that I was sitting up all night just thinking and writing, trying to make sense of this thing. And I didn't need much sleep. I mean, it needed about an hour or two of sleep. I was so energized by the experience. And he drove overnight. He got there about 6 a.m. He gave me a big hug. And he told me later it was like there was this light shining within me, that I was far more present than I'd ever been. And I remember telling him, it was way too real to be real. That's what my doctors had clued me in on. I tried to tell them about my experience, and my doctors would say, well, your brain was soaking in pus. We can't even understand how you're coming back to us. But you can forget about it, because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. Fine, that's what my doctors told me, so I believed it. Well, my neurosurgical knowledge was just beginning to come back, and it took about 2 months to fully return. And during that time period, I was going to the hospital, reviewing my medical records, talking it over with my doctors, looking at CT and MRI scans, trying to make sense of this, and it wasn't lining up. That brain was in no shape to harbor any dream or hallucination, much less the most profound, detailed, memorable, and transformative experience of my life. And that's what I was going through. And that, to me, was the deep mystery in the weeks and months after coma, was trying to make sense of that. How can this be that I had this extraordinary experience? But I was still early on in that journey when Eben drove overnight to meet up with me, and he gave me the best advice of my life at that time. He knew, studying neuroscience in college, that every time you revisit a memory, you change it. And so he told me, do not read anybody else's NDE. Write everything down about your experience, and only then can you start reading that literature. And that's what I did. I wrote about 20,000 words over 6 weeks, and then I started diving into the NDE literature, and that's where I was amazed. Because case after case, I was finding these extraordinary transformational journeys that people have that, to me, brought back memories of what I had gone through. Just the same phenomena as I mentioned a little while ago about people reading Proof of Heaven, and it reminded them of something deep in their own kind of higher soul memory that brought it to the surface. And the same thing was going on for me as I was reading these accounts. And so from that point on, especially after I saw that picture of the birth sister, and that kind of, it seemed way too real to be real because it really happened. That's when I really started the scientific journey of discovery. This kind of knowledge of the NDE, I think it's important to point out, there's a wonderful book by Ken Ring, who was one of the co-founders of the International Association of Near-Death Studies back in the mid-1970s. And I know that he wrote a book called Mindsight, and in this book, he talks about people who are blind, and many of these people had actually been blind from birth, and yet during a near-death experience, they were able to see. But vision in that situation is not, based on photons of light in the physical world hitting someone's eyes. They're due to a much more profound sense of connection and knowledge. It's much of what I saw during my journey, where I identified something that I call knowledge through identification, where you become aspects of the scene. It's something that's very common in the life review. Life reviews, as I've said, they've been around for thousands of years. And when you pay attention to the details, the scientific details of a life review, it starts becoming a much more amazing phenomenon. I'll explain that in just a second. But what I'm getting at with this Mindsight book is people's ability to become the other scene. In other words, when you're in this spiritual realm, you can become certain aspects of it to come to a deeper understanding. And knowledge through identification is a very kind of common way to describe this. Now, in life reviews, just to kind of make these points, because they really kind of refocus our attention in a powerful way. The information here that I'm presenting comes from a paper by Bruce Grayson. He's a skeptical MD psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who has studied near-death experiences for more than 45 years. And he wrote this one paper. It came out in the fall of 2021 in the Journal of Near-Death Studies. And it was of 700 life reviews that he culled from several thousand NDEs in his database. Here are the very interesting parts of his conclusions. 37%, roughly a third of these life reviews involved their entire life. Nothing was left out. This can happen during a 10-minute cardiac arrest. How can you go through your entire life in 10 minutes? Well, it's because that realm is timeless. When you're there, you're completely outside of Earth time. It's a realm that has the ability to project and glean information all across time. That's why when you visualize people explaining their life review, they're talking about birth, death, everything in between, often events of prior lifetimes and potential events of future lifetimes that are present to them simultaneously. It's one of the reasons why these are ineffable. Our language is great for describing a trip to Disney World, but not so great at describing these incredible spiritual journeys into a realm that's far vaster than we can imagine. And so your entire life can flash before your eyes in one of these life reviews. Now, almost half, 47%, said that these events were relived, not just remembered. I know a case I was reviewing a few months ago that kind of reminded me of this. It is someone who had a near-death experience as an adult, but they had also had an NDE as a child. And in the NDE as an adult, they actually had a life review where they revisited their drowning incident as a child. And he said it was so detailed he could count the mosquitoes in the air over the lake's surface. So these are reliving, detailed, not just a vague sepia-tinted memory, but relive. That's an important point. 3/4 of his life reviews stress that the review was from the perspective of everybody involved. Very, very important. In other words, when you go through a life review, you get to feel what your thoughts and actions with your fellow beings, what that felt like to them. And this is why if you hand out a lot of pain and suffering, I think you might have what's called a hellish life review, because all that comes back at you. The life review is absolutely golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the very fabric of the universe. And this sense of the life review being from all the perspectives of all involved, it's beautiful. I often say that we're sharing the dream of the one mind, that's what this is all about, that God mind. And this dream is one of transformation and growth, learning, coming to know ourselves. And by know thyself, that also implies know the universe, because all of us are sharing the mind of the universe. I often use the analogy of a diamond. And the one mind, this God mind, is this beautiful diamond with facets. We are the facets. So each individual sentient being represents a little oasis of this kind of primordial consciousness. And yet we're all in this dance, and it's how we interact. And the learning and teaching involved, the kind of challenges. I came back realizing that people who before my coma I might have seen as my nemesis or my enemy, they were trying to prevent me from getting something I wanted in life. After my NDE, I saw that those were often near and dear soul mates. But it's because we were trying to teach each other especially challenging lessons that I found them to be a challenging person. Reminds me of that beautiful, I'll paraphrase a quote from Confucius, the ancient Chinese sage, who said, if you find something objectionable in another, look within yourself. And in many ways, that's what this is all about, this reflective, life review that we interact with our fellow beings. And it's all truly about the evolution of consciousness. And I love how, as I was first coming out of my coma and doing all the research, I read about 150 books in the first 2 years, a lot about spiritual traditions, East and West, but a lot on quantum physics, on neuroscience, philosophy of mind, trying to make sense of my experience. And I remember reading Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's book, The Phenomenon of Man, written in the mid-20th century. And he is a French paleontologist and Jesuit priest. He was a scientist thinking about billion-year timescales. He was also spiritual. And he recognized back in the heady days of discussion of Darwinian evolution that there was an evolution going on, but it was far grander than just a Darwinian evolution of biological systems on Earth. That in fact, all of consciousness throughout the cosmos was in the process of evolving. And just like that old saying, all politics is local. Well, likewise, all cosmic consciousness and evolution of that one mind, of that God mind of the universe, is nothing more than individual sentient beings coming to a deeper understanding of their own relationship with the universe and with each other. And it's all through that incredible binding force of love. Now, the book that is out there available for sale that some of you might be familiar with, it's the third book I've written since my experience. There's Proof of Heaven, Map of Heaven. The third one is called Living in a Mindful Universe. And that was co-written with my life partner in this work, Karen Newell. Many of you know Karen. She's an incredibly rich spiritual mentor and sage. She's helped me come to a deeper understanding of much of this. But in Living in a Mindful Universe, we share a lot of these kind of spiritual stories, but we strengthen that by combining the kind of scientific evidence that supports this reality. The evidence all leads in one direction. The old sense that, you're either scientific or spiritual, turns out that science and spirituality greatly strengthen each other. And that becomes apparent. And in fact, you can look back on science's kind of addressing of these things. Materialist science, it was like a game of whack-a-mole. Near-death experiences, slam. Shared death, slam. After-death communication, slam. Reincarnation stories in children, slam. They're trying to wipe it all out. But if you allow it all to come forward and you study it scientifically, you find it paints a beautiful picture of the oneness of mind, that the brain is a filter. It's a reducing valve that limits that primordial consciousness down to the awareness that's necessary to help an individual being to survive and thrive in this world. Now, our ego level of consciousness is involved at that kind of superficial level of survival. But the ego is not your ally in this journey. So when I meditate an hour to a day. I've been doing that the last 12 years. I use sacred acoustics, binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And if you're interested, go to sacredacoustics.com to learn a lot more about that. But it turns out that these binaural beats are a way to influence the lower brainstem and cause an oscillation back and forth. And just like we all know of a pendulum can be used as a hypnotic stimulus by having the eyes oscillate slowly left and right, well, likewise, binaural beats cause an oscillation in the neural systems in the lower brainstem. And it's a very powerful stimulus that allows us to basically escape the notion of here, now, and sense of self and join that more primordial aspect of mind. And in using meditation and centering prayer is a beautiful way for each and every one of us as individuals to come into a connection with our higher soul, with this primordial mind, to start making more sense of our existence. And the goal in meditation is really kind of like getting into that hypnagogic space, between awake and asleep. There have been creative minds through history, scientists like Albert Einstein. He would float around in a sailboat, staring up at the sky, daydreaming. That's where a lot of his most brilliant insights came from. Thomas Alva Edison, a renowned inventor, the father of General Electric, who holds more patents than I think anyone else in U.S. history. But he had a means of holding some weights so that when he was really tired doing investigative work in the lab, he would hold these weights and he'd let himself nod off, and 2 or 3 micro naps like that, and boom, he's back and he has an answer to his problem. He didn't use, rational, logical, following the breadcrumbs. He would actually invite this assistance from the universe by getting into a hypnagogic state. Robert Louis Stevenson used a similar technique for all of his music and poetry and novels. Salvador Dali, other inventors, artists, creative people of all stripes have learned how to get into that hypnagogic space, the space between awake and asleep. And that's where meditation can be very powerful, because we can engender that state in ourselves and go within and start to explore this. Now, in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we paint this beautiful spiritual picture by telling many of the NDE stories and after-death communications. We also get into the past life memories in children. As I mentioned earlier, that's one of the strong scientific elements supporting this primacy of mind. If you go to University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, uvadops.org, their website, you'll find these are scientists at University of Virginia who have investigated past life memories in children for more than 60 years. And in over 2,500 cases that they've examined, they've actually solved the case in 1,700 of those children. That is, they actually found the person who lived before. Now, many of us are used to young children saying that, they used to be such and such or so-and-so. And you think, oh, well, that's a nice imagination. But it turns out that when you follow these stories, as these scientists have done, you find in a lot of cases that the child really is, the reincarnated form of that prior person. Interesting, though, the scientists who do this work will tell you, you must harvest those memories before age 6 or 7. Because after that, there are normal processes by which all of this is covered over. And so most of us, by age 8 or 9, there is no memory of such past lives or between lives. And yet a lot of children have them. You combine that with what is known as the amnesia of childhood. Most of us are familiar with that. And that is that we usually, as adults, don't readily remember things that happened in the first 5 or 6 years of our life. And that's because our mechanisms of memory formation and retrieval change over time as we become more linguistic and linguistically based. But it's fascinating that Ian Stevenson and now Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia have been able to document all this. So the reincarnation part is very real, but I hasten to add, I know that some audiences, they don't like hearing that because they worry, what if my loved one reincarnates before I get there? That, from my perspective, never happens. And I can say that based on all my experience reviewing near-death experiences, shared death experiences, after-death communications, and also the hospice literature. Christopher Kerr, head of Hospice Buffalo, wrote a beautiful book about 5 years ago. It's called Death is But a Dream. And Christopher Kerr in that book is only talking about hospice and terminal care. But what he finds is that 99% of his patients have the same kind of experience that near-death experiencers do of reuniting with the souls of departed loved ones. It's very common. And of course, the materialist scientists would say, oh, that's wishful thinking. You see who you want to see on the way out. But I can promise you, based on many of the stories I've heard, as well as personal experience with my own family members, that that is not true. That in fact, that when a loved one sees the soul of a departed loved one, they're getting very close to making that transition. And the loved one is real. That soul is real. That spirit is absolutely real and present in the moment. It's not just wishful thinking or some vague memory. That's a very important concept to get. And it turns out that in the, much of the 20th century, there was confusion about consciousness. There were a lot of quantum physicists back in those early days who recognized that just the experiments they were doing with the subatomic world showed them that that reality only emerged with interaction with the investigating mind. In other words, it's the mind and its intersection with this world that leads to those observations. They don't exist independently of the observing mind. That's a very important concept. You find it mentioned over and over again in quantum physics. Since then, like John Wheeler, who was in the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb. He was head of physics at Princeton. for a while, he had to come up with a participatory anthropic principle to explain the behavior of photons coming from distant stars. Anthropic, meaning that the observations you make have a lot to do with the mind of the observer. And you cannot escape that. And it's actually a very strong and kind of powerful argument for the primacy of mind in the universe. But the thing that those quantum physicists lacked was greater knowledge about the brain, the mind, spiritual experiences. And that's what's happened in the many decades since they worried about all that. Maybe a century ago when Einstein and Bohr were debating, what does this all mean? The quantum physics and the measurement paradox, contextuality. These are all things that indicate the mind and its interaction with these evolving systems points out that you're not just witnessing them independently of them, you're part of it. We're all part of it. And the mind has a tremendous amount to do with our emerging reality. For me as a healer, as a scientist, as a neurosurgeon, one of the greatest places to start looking at mind over matter is in healing and wholeness. So that, for example, we have placebo effect. 60 years of work that proves that a patient's beliefs, thoughts, and attitudes plays a tremendous role in what level of healing they're going to come to. Placebo effect is a very powerful demonstration of mind over matter, not just a sugar pill fixing a headache. Then you can move up beyond to spontaneous remission. If you go to the Institute of Noetic Sciences website, noetic.org, and put in spontaneous remission, you'll find a book that they published in the mid-1990s on 3,500 cases of people who had advanced cancer, advanced infections, what have you, and had exhausted all medical means of treatment. And yet through spiritual techniques, through emotional management, etc., they were able to evolve beyond that and do healing that was far beyond what was possible through medical intervention. In fact, that's one of the things that got Bruce Grayson so interested in NDEs back in the 1970s. He was a very rational, scientific mind. His father was a biochemist. But he recognized that some of the transformative effects that people had after NDE completely overwhelmed anything he'd ever seen medical science achieve. So incredible power of healing comes from within. And then moving beyond spontaneous remission, you can get into the category of near-death experiences with miraculous healing, like my case. And that medical case report in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases goes a long way towards making that case. Most obviously, they talk about how my brain was in no shape to have any dream or hallucination. But when they were challenged by the peer-reviewed scientific editors of the journal to explain, how do you explain his recovery, a complete recovery after a week in coma from E. coli, as sick as he was? That doesn't happen. And they said it's because he had a near-death experience. And for the peer-reviewed scientific editors of the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, now they had an explanation. And so this is why, in the scientific study of these things, we need to move beyond our kind of simplistic materialist assumptions and start really taking all the evidence around us. And all of that evidence points in one direction. Any kind of conception in the press, like you'll still read many articles in the kind of mainstream press where they try and they might entertain these possibilities, but then they always want to put in some materialist skeptic who says, well, no, we know that's all baloney because we know this can't be true. But in fact, those same scientists, if pressed to explain something like consciousness, they will say, they'll basically argue that it doesn't exist. That's what Daniel Dennett, who's kind of a skeptical atheist, militant atheist materialist, does in his book, Consciousness Explained. He should have titled it Consciousness Explained Away, because that's what he does. And they pretend it's not real, it's a hallucination. And yet, when you get into the territory of this incredible kind of healing, you're finding absolute evidence of the power of mind over matter. And that's what I think is such a beautiful gift to us all, is we are all sentient beings. We all have the power to influence our lives, our health, our wholeness and healing, and to help others. The power of prayer. My good friend Larry Dossey, Dr. Larry Dossey, has written several books on the healing words and be careful what you pray for. because it actually has quite a bit of power. So I think that the medical world is waking up to this. Back in the 1990s, there was maybe one medical school in the U.S. that had any program on spirituality and medicine. Now there are more than 40. So it's really kind of on the upswing. And as I said, all the evidence points in one direction. And once you realize that the olden days of materialist scientists and militant atheists kind of debunking and denying that any of these things are possible, but when the scientists actually study, you start finding incredible systems supporting this reality of this infinitely loving and healing force at the core of the universe that all of us can take advantage of by growing our relationship with it through meditation, centering prayer, but never forget that this world, the material world, is where we get the spiritual growth done. This is where we do the work. It's how we respond to the challenges of this life, in this body, in this world, that allow us to most fully manifest the hopes and dreams and the ideals of that primordial mind, of that God force. And so with that, what I'd like to do is thank you all for your attention. It turns out that we're in the midst of an incredible revolution that is long overdue, and it's a revolution that will take us away from the crazy polarization of our current system and move us more towards one of oneness, acknowledging the life review, the golden rule, that we're really here to take care of each other. And we really are sharing one mind. So to hurt another is to hurt oneself. And the more that this lesson gets out widely to the world at large, the better our world will be. Thank you all so much for your attention. I would like to open it up to questions. Very grateful for this audience, for this meeting, for this conference. And I'm supposed to mention for anyone who's interested, I will be signing books immediately after we leave this. And the book that we have out there, I think, is Living in a Mindful Universe. That's the third book. That's the true Proof of Heaven. Proof of Heaven is a book that has done very well around this world. It's published in over 40 languages. And it resonated with people, as I said. But Living in a Mindful Universe is what takes it all to the next level. And also for anyone who's interested, I have bookmarks that go with that book. And the interesting thing about that, let me find one of these. And I've got these for anybody here who wants one, Living in a Mindful Universe. But on the back, 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. If you go to ebenalexander.com, you will find this little banner wagging at you when you get to that welcome page. And you can leave your first name and an email address, and you'll be off and running on a 33-day email drip campaign where each day you'll get one of the major topics from this book presented to you, along with commentary and observations from more than 12,000 people who have taken the course to date. So I highly recommend anyone who's interested, just go to ebenalexander.com and get started on that course. Of course, the book, Living in a Mindful Universe, will also help tremendously, but you can get a big head start on it just by going to that 33-day journey. So now, what we will do is open it up to some questions. So yes, do we have a microphone for questions, or? We may, I think.
Hello, hello.
Here we go, here's the mic. And
Hey, Dr. Alexander, thank you so much. I really wanted to come to this this session just because for the last, I think, year, I don't even know why, but I have just been voraciously reading about the data on near-death experiences. So like Glimpses of Eternity, I read, amazing book for anybody who also wants to read it, and you know, some other ones as well.
sorry, which book? What?
Glimpses of Eternity, like you said, his book as well.
Raymond Moody's, yes.
Like the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, which kind of looks at all that data, that 30 years of data. But one of the things, and I wanted to ask you about, I think I remember reading where it says that there seems to be a correlation between the amount of healing, like physical healing, that somebody needs and the length of the near-death experience. I'm pretty sure I read something like that. I can't remember now. But do you think that for you, because there is like you should not be alive, right? So, and just the magnitude of the healing that you needed kind of dictated perhaps the length of the near-death experience being so long.
It's possible. I'm not so sure, especially from having been to that realm and seeing this, how this, eternity can be presented. Time takes on it's called the spatialization of time, but this ability to witness anything and everything throughout your life, birth to death, including past lives, etc. Once you acknowledge and recognize that these kind of events happen in a completely timeless realm that is no longer slave to earth time, I'm no longer requiring that I would think that the amount of healing necessary would correlate with how long, measured by an earth clock, somebody was away from this world. So I'm not sure I would kind of tightly make that correlation. I think the depth of my journey was very important to it, and the depth has to do with the amnesia. I mean, I really had to go for a very, very deep dive to convince me, when I came back from it all, that it was a real journey. And as I said, I went through that big struggle as I was reading the NDE literature and realizing that guardian angel is always someone of great importance to you in your life, and yet my guardian angel was someone I had never met in my life. But then to find out, 4 months after my coma, that in fact it was my birth sister who had passed over 2 years before I even learned of her existence, that got my attention. That was a real shocker. Brought me to my knees, and that's what kind of convinced me of the reality of the whole thing. So very good question. I'm not sure I have a very good answer, but it's important to acknowledge that kind of timeless aspect because a lot can happen. I mean, who would have thought that a third of NDEs would involve your entire life, every single event? And yet that's what a third of Bruce Grayson's people reported.
It may have been intensity. I can't really remember what it was, but it was something like it. There's some correlation somewhere.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Any other questions?
Yes. So a statement and a question. So first, also echoing the sentiments of thank you for sharing your story. I've listened to and read hundreds. I lost my young daughter in a tragic accident in my home less than 3 years ago, and listening and learning through the NDEs was where I found so much peace connecting to what possibly could have been her experiences. So thank you for that, and thank you because in listening and learning through all of those, there was countless individuals who were afraid to tell their story and for many years did not. So thank you.
Well, I'm so glad you're pointing out something very important. Just learning about NDEs can have an incredibly powerful transformative experience. I mean, the NDEer is improved by all this through personal experience, but also sharing these experiences is what greatly helps the whole world come up to speed. So thank you.
Definitely. In the beginning of my spiritual awakening, was NDEs. But my question is, and you may have answered this in your first book, so my apologies if you did, but some of the NDEs that I listened to, the way that they find themselves in the very beginning of that near-death experience is kind of related to their mindset on what happens to them when they die, like they end up in like a hell-like place. Did you find any correlation? And you spoke about what your adopted father, kind of what his faith was. I don't know if it was the same for you, but was there any correlation in your faith and then how you found yourself immediately in that experience?
Well, it's a point I often make that, my religious upbringing was in a Methodist church in North Carolina, pretty conventional, and then as an adult in an Episcopal church. And there were certain things in my NDE that almost defied what I'd been taught there. Much of it was aligned, certainly all the love and kindness, compassion. But for example, the sensation in the core realm of becoming one with God, that complete oneness where my very conscious awareness was directly sourced in the God force. Becoming one with God like that was not something that I was taught. And likewise, reincarnation. I mean, reincarnation was never anything that was mentioned to me in my upbringing. I certainly have become familiar after the fact with, like I know that our conventional Christianity doesn't necessarily talk about reincarnation, but Christ knew that John the Baptist was reincarnated from an earlier prophet. So, I mean, Jesus of Nazareth certainly knew about reincarnation, even if modern Christianity, because of the Council of Nicaea and the influence of Constantine and kind of the Roman Empire, drilled it out because they recognized how that could destabilize their attempts to control people with religion. But to me, reincarnation was crystal clear from the aspects of my journey, the flying fish vision, and then what I call the Ender's net vision that occurred in the core. Those were both visions, very strong visions of this kind of interwoven threads of our lifetimes, of multiple lifetimes, of our soul groups, all interacting and learning and teaching with each other in this process of transformation and evolution of consciousness. So what I often say is that your religious background might influence how you narrate your story in telling the story of your NDE, but it doesn't influence the content. The content is what we're really looking at, and the content of these things, especially when you study NDEs in large numbers. For example, there's a wonderful book by a friend of mine, Robert Koppes, C-O-P-P-E-S, and it's called The Essence of Religions. And he's Dutch, he's studied NDEs very intensively, is very knowledgeable about them. And he wrote this book, I think about 10 or 11 years ago. And in the book, he compares the 5 major religions of the modern world, the Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, as well as Hinduism and Buddhism, with NDEs. He uses NDEs as kind of the gold standard for spirituality, and then compares each one of those religions, and they all get certain marks for how well they perform all this. But ultimately, it's using NDEs and the science and study of NDEs to kind of replace religious ideologies with a spirituality that can be defined in the modern era through personal experience, through a lot of these kind of shared NDE and shared death stories, etc. And I think that has tremendous value. To me, the ultimate message here is that any religion that is about division and about kind of excluding others and not acknowledging the power of unconditional love, kindness, and compassion, that religion has really lost its way. But the religions that really just focus on the simple kind of how we're all here for each other, and it's all about love without exclusion, those religions are on the right pathway. And for me, certainly, I would say that there's no way that any kind of eternal hell and damnation makes any sense at all. But that's not to say that, for example, the life review of someone like Adolf Hitler wouldn't be an incredibly complex event, because life reviews involve your interaction with every soul that you've ever influenced. And for someone like that, who was responsible for 53 million deaths during World War II, as well as all the other trauma. And then, from my perspective, when you pay attention to what people are talking about in these life reviews and NDEs, I mean, his soul is having to experience every bit of that. And, that's a very kind of arduous thing to go through. But it doesn't mean that there's an eternal hell and damnation, even though that might take a very long time, even in that spiritual timeless realm. But I don't believe that there's any kind of eternal hell. All of our souls are gifted with this beautiful connection with that God force, with the ability to learn and grow and ascend to oneness with the divine. So thank you. Any other questions? Over here.
Yeah, I have a question. You're the first person who's ever mentioned the term God mind. I did a lot of meditations when I was a teenager and had many reincarnation experiences and memories. And I also kind of during that time and since then have premonitions of the future, quite a few of them. And when I ask myself, what does it feel like's happening? I feel like my mind is in the God mind. So you're the first person to actually use the term God mind, which I think is super interesting. I've asked other spiritual teachers why everything I've ever seen or just given to me, I never asked for anything, it just comes, has happened. And they're like, oh, it's just the probability of this and this. What is your understanding? I've never had an NDE, given what you've experienced of someone who can see what's going to happen before it happens.
Well, I would say I think there's a lot of power to that, and I put a lot of credence into that, but I do not believe that the future is ever written in stone. It turns out that statement actually also reflects my scientific knowledge that in fact there's some fascinating qualities of quantum physics that mean the past isn't written in stone either. The thing that is written in stone is the present. And in fact, John Wheeler, I mentioned him, the head of physics at Princeton, in his participatory anthropic principle, he claimed that he had similar thinking to George Berkeley, the idealist, Irish theologian who had lived 200 years earlier, who said to be is to be perceived. In other words, it's all about that perception. And Wheeler was admitting that due to his knowledge of quantum physics, that the only truth was a truth that's acknowledged in the present. And in his analysis, he was looking at photons from distant galaxies. But he was saying that in the act of observing these photons, choices made by the observing scientist influenced the photon billions of years ago, all the way back to its creation. This is another way of saying we don't really understand time, the nature of time flow. It's one of the biggest, deepest issues in kind of modern science and quantum physics, a very challenging thing that we really don't understand at all. And yet it seems to be something that all of us experience in some way. But I guess the point I'm getting at is that even if someone has a very powerful spiritual awareness of a future event, it remains to be determined if that occurs. And I'll give a very quick example of what I mean by this. There is a woman I met. We shared a drive from Virginia Beach up to Charlottesville. Her name is Amy Hardy, and she used to work for the BBC. She did a lot of very scientific documentaries on molecular biology, genetics, things like that. And so she's very scientific. And this is all available on a DVD. It's called The Edge of Dreaming, put out by PBS. So there's that if you want to go get the resource. But the quick version of the story is that one night she had a dream. She lived in southern Scotland. Her first husband had died. He was the father of the 3 children. So she lived with the 3 children and with her new husband in the farm in Scotland. And one night she had a dream that her horse came up to her and said, "Amy, are you filming? We'll get ready to film." And then, because I'm about to fall. And he fell over on his right side dead. Woo, shocking dream. She wakes up. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. She went out to the barn. Her horse is lying dead on his right side. And she's like, whoa, how did all that happen? She went back to bed. Now, she's kind of mystified by this. But the ante was up tremendously about 2 weeks later. She had another dream. And this one concerned the soul of her departed spouse, the father of the 3 children. And he said, "Amy, you're having your 48th birthday this week. Well, I thought you'd want to know it's going to be your last one. I'm sorry to tell you." And then he disappeared. So first dream with a horse, bam, and now this dream. And then she starts getting very sick. Her lungs start filling with fluid. She has what's called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and the doctors project that she's probably going to live another 6 months before she dies of this progressive, inexplicable, untreatable disease. So she starts working with a Brazilian shaman, a woman who lived up in Scotland. And she ends up, I won't go into all the details, but she finds that there is a spirit that's kind of attacking her from a prior lifetime. And she has to do battle with it in the spiritual realm. And the shaman helps her do that. And at the end of the story, and you can still watch a DVD, it's got a lot of value to it, but I must give you the punchline. It's her 49th birthday. And she's very happily celebrating. So in other words, things that we see in the spiritual realm may or may not be there to come true. Often there is lessons and potential touch points, but that doesn't mean they're absolutely guaranteed to happen. And especially if we adjust our lives and our role as a soul and come more into alignment with love, compassion, kindness, mercy, forgiveness, whatever is necessary in dealing with our fellow beings, we might be able to avoid some kind of tougher lesson that we're aimed for if we don't make those steps early on. So I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have about 6 more minutes for questions.
Great.
Yes.
I loved Proof of Heaven. Feels like I read it a long time ago, but I remember discussing it with every agnostic and skeptic I knew. Such a great book.
Thank you.
But you may have covered this in your subsequent books, but after I read that, I wondered, how does this man come back to his life? So what were the most grace-filled and seamless aspects of coming back to your 3D life, and what were the most challenging aspects?
Well, I think the most beautiful aspects were coming into a very comfortable relationship with this world, where I see every soul, and often when I'm interacting with someone, I kind of go in my mind, I kind of see them all the way back to infancy and childhood, and then I see them going into old age, and then I see them as they are right there in this moment. And I recognize the beauty and the kind of sacred glory of each and every individual soul, and how we're all working together, how we're all part of that one mind, that diamond, the facets. So we're never really separate from it. Our language can be a bit misleading because it takes us away from some of these deeper truths of oneness. That's been an amazing gift. In terms of any challenges, people often think that, they would often ask me early on, what do your skeptical scientific colleagues think about all this? Well, it turns out some of my greatest support was from science and scientists, and like the group at UVA, the group at Noetic Sciences, groups around the world who study these kind of things. Tremendous support. And I'm a member of a group, a communicating group by email of scientists who are working very hard to take this to the next level. And so looking for any of the kind of hardship aspects of it, I'm not sure. Maybe some of the early stuff, I had some of the electronic effects that you often hear about with NDEs. I had to go through 3 watches. My watches wouldn't work. The watch that finally did work was broken. The stem was all cockamamie, but it kept perfect time, oddly enough. Over months, it wouldn't vary by a second. I would walk down a street and the street light would go out when I went under it. I thought, infrastructure problems. Only later did I read that many NDEers have these microelectronic effects, mainly because the quantum world is all about electronics, so you can influence from the spiritual world. There's a whole kind of program of what's called electronic voice perception from the spiritual world. There's a project that Gary Schwartz in Tucson's working on called the Soul Phone, which will hopefully use that kind of technology to allow people to communicate with disembodied spirits. There's a lot of kind of interest in all that. But ultimately, I would say that my education about the microelectronics and quantum effects and the relationship with consciousness came through studying the work of Robert John, Jahn, and Brenda, I think Brenda Dunn is her name, at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, the PAIR Lab. And they did incredible work showing how microelectronics were kind of manipulated by the spiritual realm in a purely engineering scientific setting. So anyway, there haven't been that many hardships, oddly enough. I did take about 2 months to recover, and of course there have been attacks. There have been personal attacks, people, militant atheists who would try and discredit me and publish things that would in their mind, diminish my credibility in the world. But the reality is I've had tremendous support from the scientific community, and that includes endorsement of the books, most notably The Living in a Mindful Universe. That book has really gotten a tremendous amount of accolades from the scientific community. But to me, it's all sunny side up. It's really been a tremendous blessing.
Do you still blow out electronics?
No, that was really strong for about 6 months, and then it seemed to dissipate.
Why do you think it dissipated?
I think, the intensity. I could feel the intensity. As I said, when I first went home from the hospital, I was sleeping about 1 or 2 hours a night. I would get up, at 2 a.m. I was just, this incredible energy from this experience, trying to understand it, explain it. I wanted to know more about it all, and I was writing a lot. I didn't read a lot at first because my son's advice, don't read anything until you've written it all down. But then I started reading a tremendous amount. And it's been just an incredible, rich journey, and it's been very rewarding. In fact, I often talk these days about the difference between losing my father, my adoptive father, who passed over 4 years before my coma, and then losing my adoptive mother, in 2019 when she was 99 years old. And she had a beautiful kind of a term of lucidity event where she saw her own mother appear to her, and she knew it was real. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and she woke up her nurse and said, call my children, my mother's here. And of course the nurse didn't call us because it was 2 in the morning. And then my mom went back into her unresponsive state and then died 2 days later. But once I heard that, I knew she was imminently going to pass from this world, because that's the real deal. It's one thing that Gregory Shushan, who has written extensively about NDEs in Aboriginal and indigenous cultures, and he says the most universal ingredient is that the loved ones, the departed souls of loved ones, come back to escort them over. And that's pretty much everywhere, all the time. That's a very common ingredient. So thank you very much. Thanks for sharing. I think we have...
I think we
no
are
more
out of
minutes.
time.
Uh-oh, sorry, I think we're out of time, but I'm happy to, I guess I'm going to go sign books, but I can also answer questions over there in the book signing.
Yes.
And like I said, I've got bookmarks for anybody who wants one. Bought a few. So anyway, but I've got to head over there and sign some books. But I would like to thank you all for your attention. It's been a wonderful time. I love this conference, love this group, and hope to come back someday. So thank you all. God bless you all, and Godspeed. Hello?
I'm Dr. David. I've got a special gift for you.
Oh,
Advanced healing work with sound and light. This is really powerful.
excellent. Well, good. Well, thank you.
It's really advanced sound harmonics. Well, I love that.
What I would recommend, just reach out
Thank you, everybody. We do need to clear out the room, please. Please take all your belongings with you so we can get ready for the next expo. Once again, if I could please have your help. Everyone, please exit through the front doors. Please take your belongings with you. If you are attending the next workshop here, Shaman Durek, please exit and get in line, and we'll let you in when we're ready. Thank you.